Hey, folks, if indeed you are, folks. Layman Pascal here on Love the System, a subtentacle of the Integral Stage podcast devoted to policies, procedures, protocols, and principles that determine whether the systems in which we are embedded are A, flourishing towards sacred collective sapience that makes us smarter than we are, or B, floundering into dehumanizing flatland that makes us collectively dumb and soulless. And you couldn't find a more fitting topic, I think, than one that haunts the intersection of technology, indigeneity, ecology, culture, and legal systems. So I'm thrilled to be joined by Trevor and Lee, who went to high school just down the road from me, to talk about indigenous approaches to information ecology and the decolonization of the internets. Hi, guys.
Yeah, hey.
Hey, that was an awesome introduction. Spot on.
Good. I was thinking, since a lot of this discussion involves an orientation that puts place and ancestry at the heart of how we do sense making and distribution of control around emergent technologies, that maybe a good way to start would be for you guys to say where and who you're from, to speak to our embedded sourcing or something like that. How about you go first, Trevor?
Sure. Yeah. My name is, well, thanks for having us, first of all. My name is Trevor Jang. I'm a mixed ancestry person. On my mother's side, I come from the Wet'suwet'en Nation, which is an indigenous nation in northwestern British Columbia. Within that, I come from the Laxiliu, or the Small Frog clan. And then on my father's side, I'm Chinese, French, Canadian, and I'm mostly based here on the unceded Coast Salish territories, also known as Vancouver. And I've worked with my colleague and business partner, Lee White, for a number of years now, so I'll let him introduce himself.
Yeah, thanks. Again, thanks for having us, Layman. Yeah, my name is Lee White. I live on the unceded territory of the ChinookX Nation, and specifically the Pentlatch people. I had the opportunity as, somebody of mixed, mostly European ancestry, to grow up next to a reserve close to where you spent some time, Layman, on the Saanich Peninsula. I was, I'd say, gifted with the opportunity to understand what's often known as the land question, and to bridge, even in early years in school, the alternative perspectives and philosophies of indigenous cultures, Coast Salish specifically, where I grew up, Hulkaminum language group, and there's, I think, some amazing opportunities for us to look to traditional knowledge in terms of how to build ethical frameworks for emerging technologies. So I'm pretty stoked to be here and have this chat.
Nice. Well, if anybody listening doesn't know, I'm from Sointula on Malcolm Island on the BC coast. My mother's line's been on that coast for 5 generations. My dad worked on a Kwakutl seine boat when I was a kid, so I feel close to the land and some of the indigenous currents in the area. Now I'm in Ontario in Anishinaabe territory, which is also where my dad and his dad lived. But all the same, I come from people who always left their place and moved on, who made deep alliances with land, but who were ultimately more committed to their personal search and personal relationships. So my concerns about data sovereignty come from a kind of individualistic point of view. What is it that's different if you come at this problem from the position of being deeply intergenerationally and culturally embedded in the continuity of a particular ecosystem? What difference does that make to our framing? And anybody
can take this, Trevor, or
I'll start it off. The right to data sovereignty, like any other right when it comes to being an indigenous person, it's a collective right. So indigenous. So let's say, let's look at the land question first off before we get on to the data sovereignty. So indigenous right to our traditional territory, that's a collective right. So I have that right and responsibility to Laxiliu traditional territory as an individual person, but I only have that because I'm part of a clan and because I'm part of a traditional nation, right? So it's a collective responsibility to preserve our territories for future generations. And so when I look at that from the lens of data sovereignty, it's a bit of a mind bend, to be perfectly honest with you. How do we take those principles of being sort of one with and being that sort of that interconnection with that space that we're from, and sort of put that into a digital lens and apply that sort of same collective framework and collective way of looking at things onto something that's emerging and is using emerging technologies to apply. So I think the short answer is to your question, it's a bit of a work in progress. But Lee, what I would be interested on your thoughts, particularly on some of our sort of earlier ideations of what ChinookX was, and sort of our thinking around Indigenous consensus protocols and how that kind of got us going on this journey.
Yeah, so I'd say the origin story for ChinookX Technologies. I was invited to a conference called Partech, Participatory Technology, in Vancouver in 2017, hosted by the Human Data Commons Foundation, which really looks at the ethics of our data management at large. And well, Trevor, you and I went out on commercial and had a chat, as we often do. Before that, you seeded an idea that, in all honesty, I kind of blew off. And then at the conference the next day, that idea emerged. I asked a question, which I thought was naive, perhaps was, and it turned into this project around how the Indigenous sovereignty movement and the data sovereignty movement could find alignment. And for me, the notion of ethics in technology and ethical frameworks from my exposure to ceremony and Indigenous cultures, professionally, personally, is that there are these, I'd say, ancient governance protocols and means of coming and convening and reaching consensus. And one of the important attributes within that is that people need to come and bring their voice. They need to bring their intelligence as their gifts. And there's an understanding, as I perceive it culturally, that each of us is entrusted with these gifts by Creator that we bring into this world. So in consensus, we need to bring those. And the protocols whereby we interact, if we create a framework to build consensus around showing up in right relationship, showing up, by suspending preconceived notions and allowing emergence to evolve through us in that moment, that is an excellent ethical framework to build technology from. And again, that was like a little vision, an insight. And we're 5 years in, doing fundamental research with UBC, the School of Information and Archival Science, on how we codify Indigenous protocols in this way as a computational expression. I think the notion, again, Trevor spoke well to a collectivist culture with collectivist asset management, be it land, be it abundance. The collective came before the individual. And prestige was built, as I understand it, by what you could contribute through ceremonies like a potlatch. So if we received abundance and, on our Quakefield seine boat, how do we distribute that amongst the community and make sure that everyone is thriving? That was how the economies were managed, which I think is an elegant way of us sort of being in community, in communion, and stewarding the land in a sustainable way. So if we can bring those values into our technologies and ask people to show up with their gifts, then I think we'll have a more robust and living sort of truthing system in this post-truth era.
Yeah, I like the sense of its elegance. It also strikes me that there's a pure pragmatic element to it as well. Like the information spaces are dominated by corporate platforms and things like that, which are not individuals. You can't really be a strong individual player in these spaces. You need some kind of collective. And it also seems like if you look at it from the individual point of view, you don't get the built-in ethics element. Like ethics is related to ethos. You're ethical with people. You're not just ethical on your own. But you're 5 years in, you were saying, unless you want to address anything I just said.
Yeah, I think that for me, one of the parsing points, we talk about these in software development, is in our Eurocentric cultures, we've embraced this notion of selfish self-interest, and that markets will be driven by our selfish self-interest. And as I understand Indigenous economies, we have a colleague, Carol Ann Hilton, runs the Indigenomics Institute, wrote a fantastic book called Indigenomics, looking at new channel economic systems, which are based on reciprocity. Not so much selfish self-interest, but how we can contribute to the collective. And I find, as a parent, as a father, as a family member, I find that a much more elegant and accurate expression of my responsibilities in family and community than my own selfish self-interest. So the notionally, as we shift to these let's say indicators of reciprocity rather than indicators of personal advancement, then I believe we create more just data architecture that is looking for those relationships and maintaining those relationships, rather than a competitive environment where people are, practicing one-upmanship, selfish self-interest.
So how do you codify reciprocity?
Yeah, it's putting me on the spot, which is great. What we're working on is relational databases that are more like a neural network. And what we recognize is that truth is always becoming more, it's always evolving. And it's becoming more nuanced, and we're filling in those pieces. So I think it's a matter of creating the relationships between the nodes of intelligence, of data within that network, so that we're not holding on to a fixed sort of row and column, absolutist fatland truth. We're allowing for truth to evolve and become more sophisticated over time. And I believe that's how consciousness works. I believe through my experience in Indigenous ceremony, cultures, and teachings, that there's a really intimate understanding of that is a living whole system universe that we're part of, participating in. So I hope that helps. Trevor, I'm eating up the airwaves here.
No, you're doing so well. I don't know. I don't want to interrupt you, but I don't know.
Do you agree with Lee's worldview?
No, what I will say is, I think we often, especially in these types of circles, is we tend to romanticize our Indigenous cultures and governance systems, and for good reason. We stewarded these territories sustainably for thousands of years before this current iteration of humanity, but our systems are damaged and broken by this current iteration of humanity, right? And so it's very hard to answer the question, how do you codify reciprocity? How do you codify Indigenous values on a blockchain, for example? Because those systems and those laws and those ways of being are so disrupted by, this colonial world that we all are impacted by. So a big mission of what we're trying to do at ChinookX is help to facilitate nation rebuilding, and using data sovereignty as one tool in the toolbox that a nation has of putting those pieces of its systems back together for the betterment of everyone, right? So we sort of operate at this intersection of data sovereignty, reconciliation as well as climate action and a just energy transition. And Lee will talk your ear off that for hours. So be careful if you ask him about that. But really, it's about it's about nation rebuilding for me, and putting the tools in the toolbox to bring a system that worked in ancient times and make it applicable to today's challenges.
Yeah, I was going to ask, there's a kind of semi-standardized notion of what Indigenous data consists of. How does that play into what you guys are doing? Because you guys are obviously talking about something I think that has broader implications than the way Indigenous data is normally defined.
Yeah, Trevor, I'll leave that to you, but
sure. There's, I would say, yes. A basic answer is Indigenous data is information impacting or about Indigenous peoples, really. So it could be anything, but I think there's the sort of the context of your question is, are we talking about, our traditional knowledge, for example? That's one sort of, it's one form of Indigenous data is our knowledge about our traditional territories. So all of our legends and all of our stories that come from our culture, because we're an oral culture, all of those stories that sort of tie us to place, and from sort of a title and rights legal perspective, prove our continuous occupation of our land since pre-contact. So that's that's sort of one side of data sovereignty. Is that side, is the traditional side and the traditional knowledge, and sort of the spiritual elements that Lee was talking about, and the way of looking at as us as human beings as an extension of the landscape rather than something superior to it and here to benefit from it, right? So there's that side, and then there's the contemporary side. There's the basics of how many, just basic demographic information, man. Like, who are our members? Where do we all live? What clan do we come from? What are our skills and occupations? What do we have to offer? Like there's very much like a contemporary gap in information that we need to fill in the blanks, just to begin rebuilding our nation. So Indigenous data is data that can benefit Indigenous peoples, but for the longest time has been collected by and exploited by colonial and corporate entities.
Yeah, I'll just add that the First Nations Information Governance Council has set out what are called the OCAP principles, ownership. What are they, Trevor? You run through those.
OCAP, ownership, control, access, and possession. So I mean, that's basically the standard for Indigenous nations within Canada, at least, is that nations have the right to the ownership, the control, the access, and the possession of any information regarding our lands, our people, our language, our history, our culture. That's the standard.
Yeah, and I think through our research, what we discovered is that Indigenous people have had an awareness of data sovereignty, probably more so than any other subsect of our population. And that's, as Trevor mentioned, because of colonial frameworks impacting their way of life, way of being, and when it came to data collection, there was this high-level recognition of, like, you can't just take our data. Like, you've taken so much, right? Our land, our children, our futures, in so many ways, huge impact on culture. And there's this heightened awareness around the importance of data. It started, decades ago. What that enables is with the legal affirmation of Indigenous title, Aboriginal title, as it would be expressed in our legal system, and rights, that we have opportunity to create a jurisdiction that's aligned with Indigenous law, that honors these values and the values of individuals' contributions, and individual ownership and control of personal data. So what we recognize notionally is we have an opportunity to create these islands of sovereign data where individuals' rights are upheld for everyone. And the corporate entities that manage our data are often referred to as hyperscalers, and they have a monetary model based on buying and selling people's attention. They use location tracking and predictive analysis with psychological profiling so that they can understand and predict how people will purchase and vote. So our data is being harvested en masse to inform how we engage in the future by shareholders and groups with short-term interest in an economic framework that is fundamentally feudal and colonial. So what we see at ChinookX is an opportunity to create these islands of civic integrity where the data is protected and upheld, and the individual interests around that data can be controlled by individual owners of data. So it's one thing that I find remarkable with the numerous nations, Indigenous nations across Canada, is despite the Indian Act, which is essentially genocidal policy, and all the impacts that have been legislated and carried out quite brutally, that cultures have endured and survived. And although they've been seriously impacted, there's these threads of truth that remain from these cultural processes. Now, Trevor's engaged in this with his clan and how we revitalize that using data. I think that's, as a tangible example, what you're working on, Trevor, if you could share a bit, would kind of articulate what we're working on from a practical perspective.
Yeah, so we're very early stages of community engagement, pretty much, but we're in the early stages of starting to establish data sovereignty for my clan. So, just to sort of piggyback on what Lee's talking about here. So if we look at my nation as an example, so the Wet'suwet'en Nation, we have our traditional hereditary governance system of 5 clans, and within each clan we have several house groups, for 13 house groups in total. Each of those ancestral lineages has a hereditary house chief, and those names and those rights and titles and stewardship responsibilities have been passed on generation to generation. And then Canada came along, and we have the Indian Act now, and that has imposed the elected band council system on us. And there's been a clash ever since, and it's a struggle to unify around these conflicting systems ever since, and that's a very live challenge that continues. We don't have unity within our nation, and it's hard for us to make collective decisions, particularly around major decisions that impacts all of our clans and all of our communities across the territory, right? So we really don't have that decision-making mechanism in place right now. And I think a good starting point is to begin to build up our traditional societies and systems through data sovereignty, because on the clan side of things, we don't have baseline data, right, about who we are and our relations. We have data about us as individuals collected through the Indian Act system, as most of us are members of one of our 6 Indian Act bands. But that data has always been collected through that colonial lens, by and for the federal government, right? That is basically providing us peanuts on an annual basis to keep us alive, but not thriving, right? But we don't know on at least for the Wet'suwet'en example, we don't know how many clan members we have. We don't know where all of our clan members live. We don't know how many elders we have, how many youth we have, what our educational backgrounds and skill sets are. We don't know our cultural gifts, our cultural abilities. cultural knowledge. We don't have all of that mapped out and codified within a way that is accessible, right? Like we have a bunch of boxes in an office somewhere filled with cultural knowledge from our ancestors, and that's basically what we have. And it's like, how do we take that and make it accessible and put it into a relational database that our clan has that unique ownership and permissions that we've established and protocols on top of it, to just begin relating to each other in a way that makes sense, and it becomes a tool that we can then perhaps bring to the other clans if this pilot project goes well, to begin rebuilding that side of our nation to the point where we can look at both systems equally and be like, all right, how do we merge here? How do we bring the nation back together? So that's just one example of my nation and some of our challenges, but it's not an uncommon story, particularly for Indigenous nations in what's now called British Columbia, where for the most part there were no treaties signed, and it's very much unceded lands, this side of the Rockies, and yeah, so it's very exciting. It's very groundbreaking stuff, and a lot of what we're trying to do hasn't been done before. Particularly, you can speak to this side, but utilizing what we're doing on these unceded territories to help build up our nations, to then create a unique data sovereignty jurisdiction that we can then resell to the global market to help make this sustainable, right? So we actually want to put the cloud computing infrastructure on Indigenous lands to support everything we're talking about, nation rebuilding and all of that good stuff, but also to make it work from an economic point of view, reselling that additional compute capacity to the broader market to make it sustainable, right? So we can keep this work going.
Yeah, I think that a lot of my orientation comes around energy policy. I, in 2005, was a Green Party candidate in the provincial election. And I was really, there was two issues that I was passionate about, and that's energy transition, implementing renewable energy, and also Indigenous reconciliation, just because of how I grew up, where I grew up. And then I spent a couple of years working in post-apartheid South Africa, and really was able to see the parallels between the apartheid policy framework and the Indian Act, which was a precursor to apartheid. And it just made me ask questions about why the status quo existed in Canada. So in British Columbia, we have an extensive hydropower network through BC Hydro as a Crown centralized corporation. But unceded territory and Indigenous title lands raises question about the notion of Crown land and Crown assets like that. And in many ways, I would just, BC Hydro is created by the BC Energy Act, and then there's new layers and layers of law put upon it, the Clean Energy Act, which has recently been revised. So we have these tremendous assets, and I would say the legacy impacts of BC Hydro on Indigenous communities and nations have been significant. And I believe that those nations have rights and title to those land assets, to that energy. And a data center, a server farm, the biggest input cost is energy. So we have an abundance of energy. BC Hydro now describes it as an oversupply of energy because of the downsizing of our forest sector, which was our largest industry for decades. And so we have a bunch of underutilized energy. So notionally, if we build this sector and enable Indigenous communities to participate in partnership with BC Hydro in modernizing our grid, implementing smart grid nodes around these data centers and the uninterrupted battery supplies that are required, the surge protectors for your supercomputers. That gives us the fundamental infrastructure to modernize our grid and accelerate energy transition towards electrification, which are the objectives of our provincial and federal government. But it's in terms of implementing policy on the ground, it's always very difficult. And BC Hydro is really confined by these layers and layers of old legislation. So we've really seen the opportunity, guided by some of the work with Hydro looking at future grid, around what they called innovation sandboxes, and we're developing Indigenous innovation districts where we can bring in these high performance compute centers with sovereign data, again, for the communities and their data, but also for enterprise corporations that want enhanced assurance of sovereign data that aren't really subject to the Patriot Act and certain eyes, like health data, as an example, has really tight legislative requirements, because it's our data is vital, and how it's managed is absolutely crucial. So for us to be able to innovate some integrating emerging technologies so that we can have better performing systems with our energy grid that's modernized, and with our data management systems, we kind of have this amazing unique business opportunity that is really the opportunity for these Indigenous nations to embrace and bring what's known through the Indian Act as own source revenue, their own independent revenue. And what has been known, it's often called the Harvard study, but there was this extensive study into self-determination, and economic development is widely understood to be the driver towards self-determination and self-governance. So creating sustainable economic base through this model of Indigenous innovation districts, through sovereign data, and modernizing the energy grid, we see is the future of reconciliation for communities, or a large part of it, from the economic driver standpoint. And clean energy and energy advancement is a stewardship responsibility that I think is best understood through these traditional knowledge frameworks. And Trevor, you can speak to, I think, more accurately, with all the consultation with communities you've done, to how that fits with Indigenous values.
Yeah, probably. I probably could.
Right.
Is this, are there similar projects you're aware of going on in other parts of the world, or is this quite unique?
There's I know there's a group that's focusing on Bitcoin mines, on distressed forestry assets. They're looking at this oversupply of energy and, a market opportunity. There are definitely some innovators working on some software solutions for sovereign data, and there's a number of providers that are providing like open source software and hardware stacks that honor sovereign data principles, but not really from a policy lobbying perspective, which is really our focus, is creating a framework where this can take place. And again, there's considerable interest from different levels of government, different agencies, and providers who are looking for these solutions. So, to my knowledge, there's things that are close, but not something that has our nuanced focus. Yeah, so we seem to be fairly unique.
We're certainly weird. I think weird.
That's, I think, traditionally a good sign. Trevor, you were talking about the sort of two competing layers or styles of Indigenous self-government, the older one and the one that was sort of imposed later on. Is there some reason to think that the older one is significantly better at self-organization and collective intelligence, or should we be looking to some new emergent system that maybe reconciles the two that are struggling with each other?
That's an excellent question. And I think it depends. I think every Indigenous nation is just that, right? A nation, and they are on their own journey of coming out of, or coming out from underneath the colonial project known as Canada, right? And how that is looking in real time, as it is happening right now as we speak, is different for every nation. So some you have incredibly strong, resilient, traditional hereditary governance systems that were damaged and broken, but never quite broke completely, right? And now they've rebuilt quite beautifully, and we're in some talks with some nations that have that hereditary governance system front and center, and that is who, as an outsider coming into that nation, that is who you are engaging with. And then you have nations that for whatever reason just didn't quite have that, or were hit harder by the blunt force of colonialism, and so their system, just a lot of that knowledge is more watered down, I guess, throughout the generations, unfortunately. And so because of that, you have the imposed upon colonial system that has sort of taken root, but with the values of that community, right? So even though it is a sort of foreign imposed system, it can still be utilized for the betterment of the people. It just really depends. And then you have hybrids. So you have hybrid models that are emerging that take the best of both worlds. So really there's no way to say that one is better than the other, because it's all very much placed on context of where each nation is in their own sort of decolonial and indigenizing journey. And so I think going at it from the lens of data sovereignty is a way of sort of helping that nation answer that question over time, because you're rediscovering so much about yourself and your own people in that journey.
So I think for a lot of people, there's ambiguity around words like colonial and decolonization, right? I mean, it's corporate, or it's federal, or it's a type of structure, or it's a type of an attitude. How do you guys think about those words? Like in general, what do you think colonial means, and what do you think decolonization means?
You want me to take a crack? Well, colonial, the crown, we were part of this Commonwealth, which was the English colonial framework. Our legal system has, and our parliamentary governance system were largely informed by the Westminster system coming out of Britain. Yet, John Ralston Saul wrote elegantly about this in his book, A Fair Country, where he says Canada is fundamentally a Métis nation, and that Indigenous governance had a huge impact on the Westminster system. So colonial, I'd say, is this notion of Canada, which started off by as a entrepreneurial venture by the Hudson's Bay Company, largely beaver pelts to make top hats for Europe. So as a nation state, we seem to be founded on a fashion craze in Europe. And what I appreciate about the diverse Indigenous perspectives is that there's an understanding of this continent, Turtle Island, without the colonial framework, without that Eurocentric impact. And so decolonizing, I think, is in many respects seeing beyond the short history of colonization, recognizing that groups of people lived on this continent for epochs prior to the European experiment that we call Canada. Now that said, we're not turning back time. We have to manage our romantic nostalgia, and see how we can collaborate. And I believe these protocols of how we convene and how we show up. My takeaways from these traditional governance is that there was a deep participatory democracy embedded in traditional governance, and that is how you steward and your land and resources, and that is how you collaborate or even deal with conflict with neighboring communities. So somebody took me aside once when I was speaking at a conference, and I was speaking about this notion of Indigenous data sovereignty for everyone, decolonizing data. I think and this person said, it sounds like you're referencing what's known as the Great Law of Peace. And at the time that Europe was colonizing the world on Turtle Island, the nations were drafting the Great Law of Peace, which was a way of living in sustainable coexistence with one another, and respecting the diversity of different nations, clans, and people's views. So that respect of diversity, I think, is the strength of the distributed governance of these traditional systems. Because I think when we look at evolving systems, and when we looked at the theory behind collective intelligence, the diversity of views is the strength of the collective. And if we fall into groupthink scenarios, it's usually because we're deferring to a homogeneous perspective. So the diversity of clan governance is the strength of these traditional systems that I think can inform how we operate moving forward. I just really dug into colonial and used decolonization. Trevor, anything to add on that?
No, what Lee said.
Yeah, I do like the notion of indigenization. So from my lived experience, when growing up on the Saanich Peninsula next to, Sartlip, Pakachin, Sekum reserves, I had a lot of exposure to Indigenous ways of being, just informally through friends. And as someone who didn't come from a family that had faith, those teachings they resonated, and they gave me sort of a framework. So I believe that my thinking was indigenized by those teachings. And I do believe that they are probably the best parts of me as a way of contextualizing how I interact and live in the world. So I believe that the Indigenous teachings and ways of seeing the world are fundamentally healthy for all of us.
Yeah, that's something I think about a lot, is sort of what are the skills and practices that allow us to become Indigenous more quickly? Because some people are in a continuity culturally and ethnically whereby they receive a lot of the results of long periods of time through which people became Indigenous to places. But it looks like we're going forward into a world where there's going to be a great deal of ecological instability, a great deal of climate change, a great deal of migration, right? There's going to be the need for people to become Indigenous to new places because so many individuals and communities and ways of life will be constantly displaced in the world that's coming. So how do we build up the capacity to become Indigenous more quickly when we're not going to have necessarily many generations of adaptation in which to do that? Any thoughts?
Well, I feel like the land is something that connects. Our connection to the land is is somewhat synonymous or related to an experience of our own indigeneity. You know, if we think back, all cultures, like, you know, my ancestors from northern Europe, you know, widely displaced now, we're tribal, we're indigenous to a land and to a place and to different worldviews, and there, you know, the notion of empire continued to expand and has, and we now associate it with sort of colonialism, and modernity brought, you know, so much homogeny. I think, like, this is how we do things, you know, strip malls and consumerism and, you know, hyperscalers that manage your data. They give you stuff for free. You are the product, but they give you stuff for free, man. Like, think about it. You get your Gmail, you don't have to pay for it. They're just harvesting your personal information and using it to persuade you on how to live. And I don't want to demonize them, but that's our imperial experiment gone wild. And I'd say unsettling our civic framework and fabric and the fundamental governance and relationship we have with place. So I feel like the land is something that ignites it in us. I think that's why in British Columbia, we have a kind of a unique environment. I think in Canada, like the landscape is, we have a lot of it relative to the number of people. And the landscape is massive and robust and awe-inspiring. And I feel like that the humility that brings sort of brings us into that experience. But I don't identify as Indigenous, but I recognize there's an element of me that holds indigeneity. And you know, I live a life of white privilege, and have lived a life of white privilege, and I acknowledge that. It's real. I saw it right through my school environment, and today still see it.
Yeah, I think just from my own personal experience with that, you know, being like, so I've, you know, I think decolonization starts individually, like decolonizing our own minds, right? Decolonizing our own minds, our own hearts, our own worldviews, and that's a journey everyone is on, whether they know it or not. But so, you know, for me on that journey, like I am Indigenous to these lands, and I didn't always really know what that meant. I didn't even always know that I was Wet'suwet'en. Sort of learn that depth of who I was in my teenage years and early adulthood, and then as an adult, sort of for a long time struggling to reconcile the fact that I'm Indigenous. I'm also Chinese, and I'm also have European ancestry, right? So I'm Indigenous, an immigrant, and a colonizer, settler, all to the same land. and so that's, you know, that's a good example of Canada right there. Is like we have these seemingly irreconcilable elements of ourselves that need to be reconciled, both individually at the individual person level, but then at the community level and at the nation level. Like, you know, we were talking about what Canada is in terms of colonization and really just being a colonial experiment built on commerce, right? And this really this fetish for going as far and wide and dominating as far as wide as you can. And then we have these ancient traditional systems that are very damaged, but very much still here and very much still alive. And it's, you know, trying to reconcile those two seemingly irreconcilable things, but it's holding these conflicting notions in your head at the same time, and just kind of being okay with the fact that maybe those pieces don't really fit, and just kind of being okay with that regardless.
I think consensus is messy. As much as we might think that we might have a Pollyanna perspective, but when I've witnessed like reaching consensus, it's a tussle. And I think that's actually a living truth that we're becoming. And you know, I believe that consciousness is what wants to evolve. And that's how we carry it out, is not holding on to sort of static notions of what we believe to be true yesterday, but allowing a more nuanced and sophisticated sort of sense of truth, a more whole sense of truth. You know, from the interval perspective, one of the tenets that really serves me is, you know, there's these massive different ways of inquiry, and some seem conflicting, but all hold a degree of truth. But all those truths are partial, and that it's the mosaic where you can find a more whole truth. So I think we're, as we open ourselves to the diverse ideas of these messy collectives, then we're allowing the consciousness to evolve through us. And for me, what participating in ceremony in particular enabled me to experience that, you know, how and what I came to understand is that we all are like tuning forks for truth, and that, you know, usually are like you can feel energetically when there's a deep resonant truth. I don't know if you guys have that experience.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, because it seems like there was an overemphasis in the 20th century on participating in the evolution of consciousness in a purely individual interior fashion. And I'm seeing a lot of people start to rebalance that with a move toward more shared, more collective, more ceremonial practices that are necessary to help us all participate in that same process.
Yeah. And I think that in some ways there's a process through ceremony, through ritual, where we surrender ourselves to that collective gestalt. And we're a part of it, and a crucial part of it, but we're not all of it. And that's a beautiful experience, to be part of something. And again, I think that is something that is understood and preserved in these pockets of traditional governance that are still being held on to, the knowledge keepers. Trevor, do you witness and experience that?
Sure did.
Yeah.
I have a curiosity around what sort of Indigenous languaging is used for information and data. Are there, in general, pre-existing words that fit this very well, or are words being modified in their meaning, or new words invented? How are these terms spoken in these languages?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I don't really have an answer for that, but I do know that it's like, I think that Indigenous people are the earliest advocates in Canada, at least, for data sovereignty. It just hasn't always been called data sovereignty or looked at as data sovereignty. So I don't think that there is, in Wet'suwet'en anyways, I don't think that there is a word for data or data sovereignty, you know, but I think it's more just like our knowledge and our wisdom of knowing who we are. You know, there's concepts for that, for sure. And then it's sort of tied through the generations too. You know, I think of the concept in Wet'suwet'en, at least, of the spirit of the land, right? And how that is this living, breathing thing that connects all Wet'suwet'en people, past, present, and future, all at once, being here with you through your experience of place. So I think new, you know, because these are new technologies for new challenges. I think there needs to be a continuous evolution of culture, for sure, but grounded in those principles that are timeless.
How sovereign can data really be in the information environment? Like, assuming you got, really robust legal acknowledgement and protections, aren't there so many different kinds of information predators that anybody who wants it can still just take it?
Well, you need to protect your data architecture from what are often referred to as bad actors, and so you have to maintain it in a way that provides like a transparent look into that data architecture, where the sovereignty is who can access that transparent view is the big question. So we're working on legal frameworks that would honor and respect individuals' privacy and control and ownership and the permissions for people to access the data. But we have to protect people's data from bad actors as well. I think that a lot of folks are concerned about the Patriot Act and the NSA scouring personal information, and I think that there are some considerable, there's a lot of merit to that, to deep state looking in, and I think that the corporate model for data management that is deployed by the hyperscalers is just we're looking, and the way that data is housed, held, and managed is done by private entities that are incorporated. But I see that data and the way it flows between these processing nodes as civic infrastructure. And so from a legal and regulatory framework, we're looking at how do we maintain the integrity of civic infrastructure without a colonial bias that is based on private ownership, or public ownership, public corporations owning and being incentivized to monetize those data sets. And I think it's a byproduct of some of our selfish self-interest assumptions of, neoclassical economics. So I think a lot of the solutions will be within some of the traditional knowledge and the protocols for ethical interaction that are preserved. We don't have whole answers to that. We have a research process and we have a framework to work within them, a way of truth telling that's defined by elders and knowledge keepers. So as somebody who has some coding experience and background and is interested in algorithm development in particular, the fundamental bias of Eurocentric thought towards data architecture is what we're trying to avoid. But all I can ask for is agnostic frameworks that will honor a specific user group's protocols and make sure that we have interoperable ways so different clans can communicate and operate and function, even though they have slightly nuanced protocols. So there's, I'd say, the perennial characteristics that we're identifying, and we're doing so through research and through learning systems, machine learning. These systems, they're trained by knowledge keepers. So.
Where does the name ChinookX come from? Does it just sound cool, or did you choose it for a special reason?
Yeah, I'll leave that to you, Trevor. Yeah. I think it sounds cool.
Yeah. Yeah, the name ChinookX. Well, it comes from the Chinook jargon, or Chinook Wawa, which was a sort of mishmash of several indigenous languages from throughout what is now the Pacific Northwest. And it was developed to help facilitate trade and commerce between sovereign and indigenous nations, right? That were working together for the betterment of all. It was kind of like the original DAO, the original decentralized autonomous organizations, right? And so that was, really the Chinook ecosystem. It was built on, traditional goods like salmon. So that's why, our logo is a salmon, because there's a spiritual but also very real economic relationship that our people have had salmon since pre-contact times that continues to this day. So it's a nod to that, and it's also with the X. It's also crossing it with modern and emerging technologies to try and bring those two worlds together. Plus, it just sounds badass. So.
Yeah, I think part of the X was a sort of a shout out to SpaceX and the whole notion of terraforming Mars. And my sentiment is, well, why don't we put a steady effort into preserving this planet? Let's see if we can make this livable. So I think that's sort of part of the X. That functioned in, but yeah, I don't know. Of the Chinook jargon, skookum is probably the best preserved word that still makes it into modern vernacular. I don't know if you're familiar with that, or
it's one of my favorite words. It gives you a real visceral resonance, skookum.
Yeah. So, and in part, what we recognized, within our team, of mixed ancestry and heritage, is that the trade language that all nations traded, and that there was extensive trade pre-contact. And the grease trails were known, and Ulukan grease was what they're named after, which and I think this is beautiful, that the Ulukan was essentially like the equivalent of the gold standard, if you will. But Ulukan, its great value was it was portable but incredibly nutritious. You could preserve it, hold it, sustain it for a long time, and it would help people deal with scarcity and famine. Like it would, so that was its fundamental value for the trade routes. And when early traders came, there were harmonious relationships between settlers and the indigenous inhabitants, and extensive trade. And I think that is, looking forward, what we can aspire to create in Canada is in this experiment called Canada, which I think we're still early in. And I think embracing the indigenous way of being on this land and stewarding it is what we need to do more effectively in all our systems, in our technologies, in our infrastructure. And that will lead to a more sustainable and just, equitable place for everyone. That's my romantic notion of it.
Not bad. It's not bad. I like it. This is obviously the year that chatbots and large language models have been exploding. Does AI mean anything to the project you're working on? Does it change anything? Is there a role for it going forward as it gains capacity?
Yeah, it's here. I think that what my eyes are on is ethics in AI, and how do we sort of gauge and have these living truthing systems within it. I think it's going to become much more necessary. And I also think with Indigenous innovation districts and this providing civic infrastructure for information integrity is going to be much more vital at this time. So I think it comes down to these living truthing systems that we aspire to model and create. I do feel that through the research we're doing, that we can have, we can introduce quantum computing through relational databases that are informed by Indigenous knowledge systems. That's a hypothesis, an aspiration, but I see it as possible. There's a bunch of engineering to happen in between, that notion and making it a reality, but it is something that we're actively talking on and working on with partners.
Who do you guys look to as good thought resources in this area?
Thought resources?
Yeah, like who do you listen to? Who do you read? Whose thinking informs the kind of project that you guys are working on?
Well, I think we talked a little bit earlier in the hour about sort of who's been in this space, and we didn't really name any names, but we sort of spoke on, there's people doing like sort of software solutions for Indigenous data sovereignty. I sort of before ChinookX sort of got off the ground, I was doing some quite a bit of work with Indigenous technology based in Victoria, and they're deep in the process of developing an Indigenous data sovereignty software solution. And so I co-authored a digital ebook with them called DataBack, #DataBack, asserting and supporting Indigenous data sovereignty. And I work closely with Anamiki CEO Jeff Ward, who's Ojibwe, as well as Jeff Doctor, who is their impact strategist. He's a techno-sociologist or something really fancy like that. Anyways, he's a really smart dude, and so he's worked in his nation and applies very much that Indigenous impact lens to development. And so I learned a lot working with those two in particular. But there's Gwen Phillips, who's sort of I don't know, the grandmother of the Indigenous data sovereignty movement, at least in BC. And there's so many trailblazers. I don't want to just start giving a list of names, but those were who immediately jumped to mind for me.
I referenced Carol Ann Hilton and the Indigenomics Institute. That's a wonderful framework. Reuben George is a big influence. He's from Tsleil-Waututh, Coast Salish, and he is an advisor and working on energy solutions. For me, conceptually, from a physics perspective, I consider myself a Bohmian, David Bohm's work. And there's a Professor Leroy Littlebear, I believe he's at the University of Lethbridge, and he participated in dialogues with Bohm and wrote about how the Bohm's quantum interpretation was fundamentally the Blackfoot worldview. So the bridging of Indigenous cosmologies and quantum theory has always been really inspiring to me, from a super geek perspective. And I see how that thought is fundamentally different, like epistemologically, ontologically different world truthing, world relationship systems. So that's essentially where we're sort of listening to people who are knowledge keepers. I think that's as a company, we will ask this guiding question: is this the creator's path? And it's a strange way to do business, but it seems to be working for us. We're asking what wants to emerge here, what wants to come out, where does consciousness want us to take this, and who do we need at the table to bring their gifts and their insights to make this a reality. So our approach as a small entity that works in partnership with multiple stakeholders on projects that are much bigger than us, it's really everyone who comes to the table that we listen to, kind of in that living system. I would shout out to Dr. Vicky Lemieux from blockchain at UBC in the School of Information Technology and Management for a lot of technological leadership and passion around traditional perspectives in technology, the Human Data Commons Foundation and the Partech Conference. And that community really helps inform. And I do want to reference a close friend, Gord Petrick of Nietzsche Management, based in Ottawa, who was an Indigenous thought leader. And then we spent a lot of time ruminating on Indigenous blockchain systems. And there's some exciting things coming down the pipe. There's amazing thought leaders in this space. For me, one thing that continues to blow my mind is the deep intelligence and capacity of emerging Indigenous leaders like Trevor. Just and I believe it's when you can think outside of the orthodoxy of our cultural milieu, that's where you can access these transformational ideas. Yeah.
Terrific. And it's, I agree. This is tremendously exciting stuff. These are really rich conversations that open up new pathways going forward. And they're conversations like I didn't hear anybody having just a few years ago. So I'm fascinated by what's emerging here. And I think we're probably coming just about to the end of our discussion, but is there anything I didn't ask you that I should have? Is there anything lingering around we still want to surface here before we finish?
Yeah, I'm
Not
not
at all.
feeling.
Silence speaks volumes.
Yeah, that's right.
There's consensus.
Fantastic. Then my only other questions involve the book Wrapped in Awe, but I'm not going to ask them. I'm going to thank you guys both and wrap this up. This has been a really nourishing conversation. Thanks very much, guys.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much for reaching out to us.
Yeah, no, I appreciate what you do. And it's been a real joy to participate.